The studio lights burned hot that evening in 1971, but the temperature in the room had nothing to do with the equipment. What happened in the next 8 minutes would be replayed, debated, and studied for the next 50 years, not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. The most famous athlete on the planet walked into a television studio expecting another interview. He left having taught a master class in dignity that no one saw coming. Muhammad Ali had been stripped of everything 3 years earlier. In April 1968, when the Supreme Court was still deliberating his conscientious objector status, boxing commissions across America had already made their decision. His titles were gone. His passport was revoked. His prime years, from 25 to 28, when a heavyweight's body is a perfect weapon, were spent in exile, giving speeches on college campuses to pay legal bills that kept mounting. By 1971, he'd fought his way back, but the return had been brutal. Joe Frazier had taken what Ali believed was rightfully his, the heavyweight championship, in a 15-round war at Madison Square Garden. Just months before, Ali's jaw had been broken. His undefeated record was shattered. And now, America's sports media, which had largely supported the government, case against him, wanted to pick at the wounds. The journalist was a man named Frank Bannister, a 38-year-old sports columnist for a major newspaper syndicate, and he built his reputation on hard questions. Bannister wasn't a bigot in the performative sense. He'd written in favor of integration, supported Jackie Robinson's legacy, even defended black athletes when Southern papers called him ungrateful. But he'd also written repeatedly that Ali was a coward, a draft dodger who hid behind religion, a loudmouth who claimed principles but really feared bullets. Bannister's readers loved his bluntness, his willingness to say what others only whispered. His editor had told him before the show, "Make him own it. Make him admit he was wrong." Bannister had nodded because he believed, genuinely believed, that Ali had cheated. Cheated the men who'd gone to Vietnam, cheated the fans who'd paid to see him fight, cheated the title he'd abandoned. In Bannister's mind, this interview wasn't about cruelty, it was about accountability. Ali, for his part, had walked into the studio alone. His cornerman, Bundini Brown, had offered to come, but Ali had waved him off. He wore a dark suit, the kind he'd started wearing after his conversion. Simple, dignified, no flash. The cameras were already rolling when he sat down, the red light glowing like a judge's eye. The host, a local sports anchor named Tom Hendricks, smiled nervously and made introductions. The audience, about 200 people seated in risers, applauded cautiously. Half of them had cheered when Frazier knocked Ali down. Half had wept. Hendricks opened with a softball question about training, and Ali answered with his usual rhythm, poetic, self-assured. Funny, the audience laughed. Bannister, seated in the second chair, hadn't laughed. He waited until Hendricks asked about the draft case, then leaned forward, his voice cutting through the studio like a blade. "Let me ask you something, Mohammed." The use of the first name was deliberate, casual, stripping away the formal distance. "You say you're a man of principle. You say you couldn't fight in Vietnam because of your beliefs. But you fight for money every month. You get punched in the face for a paycheck. So what's the difference? Is it just that the army doesn't pay as well as a title fight?" The audience went silent. Not the slow fade of polite quiet, but the sharp, a collective intake of breath that comes when a line is crossed. Hendricks shifted in his seat, glancing at the control booth. Ali's face didn't change. He looked at Bannister the way a teacher looks at a student who's just asked a question so poorly framed that answering it would require rebuilding the entire premise. Bannister pressed on, his voice rising. "You say you're fighting for your people, but when your country called, you said no. When the government asked you to serve, you hid behind the Quran. And now you want us to call you the greatest? Greatest at what? Dodging?" The room held its breath. This wasn't a debate. It was a public execution, televised, with no rebuttal allowed because the host was frozen and the audience was too shocked to intervene. Bannister had landed the punch he'd been hired to throw. He sat back, waiting for the explosion, the anger, the deflection, the defensive sermon he'd heard Ali give a dozen times before, but Ali didn't explode. He didn't deflect. He tilted his head slightly, the way a man does when he's listening to a child explain why the sky is green, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter than anyone expected. "You don't know me," he said, not as an accusation. "As a fact, you don't know why I did what I did. You just know what you read." Bannister opened his mouth to respond, but Ali raised a hand. Not aggressive, just a pause. "Let me tell you something. You think I was scared of bullets. You think I was scared of dying." He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Bannister's, and the force of his presence filled the space between them. "I was scared of living wrong. I was scared of killing somebody's son for a reason I didn't believe in. You ever been scared of that? You ever been scared that maybe if you do what they tell you, you'll lose yourself?" The question hung in the air, and for the first time, Bannister looked uncertain. Ali continued, his voice still soft, but the words cutting deeper than any shout could. "You call me a coward because I wouldn't go. But I stayed. I stayed in this country when they took my title. I stayed when they tried to put me in jail. I stayed when people like you wrote that I was a disgrace. That takes something too. You just don't want to call it courage because it don't fit your story." The silence was unbearable now. Bannister's jaw tightened. He'd come to this studio with facts, with public opinion on his side, with the weight of the entire sports establishment backing his question, but Ali had shifted the ground beneath him. The journalist tried to recover, his voice sharper, more defensive than before. "That's a convenient answer, Mohammed. You make it sound noble, but the men who went to Vietnam, some of them didn't believe in it either. They went anyway. They died anyway. What do you say to their families?" It was the killing blow, or it should have been, the emotional hammer that would force Ali into either apology or arrogance, either of which would confirm Bannister's thesis. Ali closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, something had changed. The performance was gone. The rhymes, the bravado, the armor he wore in press conferences, it was stripped away, and what remained was a man sitting in a hot studio, exhausted from years of being made into a symbol, trying to explain something that couldn't be explained in sound bites. "I say I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry they had to go. I'm sorry they died. I'm sorry their families hurt, and I'm sorry I couldn't stop it." He paused, and the weight of those words settled over the room like a heavy fog. "But me going wouldn't have brought them back. Me killing somebody else's son wouldn't have saved theirs. And I gotta live with my choice, the same way you gotta live with calling me a coward for making it." Bannister stared at him, and for the first time since the interview began, he looked like a man who just realized he'd walked into the wrong fight. Although he wasn't angry, he wasn't defensive. He was just there, a present, vulnerable in a way that made the attack feel hollow. The journalist's hands, which had been resting confidently on his lap, tightened into fists, not in aggression but in something closer to confusion. He started, then stopped. His producer had told him to push. His editor had told him to break Ali, but breaking required something solid to shatter. And Ali wasn't solid. He was water, moving around every blow, reshaping the space until the attacker was the one off balance. The host, sensing the shift, tried to move on to another topic, but Ali cut him off gently. "Can I ask you something, Frank?" The use of the first name mirrored Bannister's earlier tactic, but where Bannister's had been dismissive, Ali's was intimate, almost tender. "What do you think makes a man great? Is it doing what's easy or doing what's right, even when it costs you everything?" Bannister didn't answer immediately. His mouth opened, closed. The audience, which had been frozen in shock, began to shift. A cough here, a whisper there. I think a man is great when he serves something bigger than himself," Bannister said finally, and his voice was quieter now, less certain. Ali nodded slowly. "Then maybe we agree. You just don't think my service counts. And that's okay. You don't have to, but I do." The transformation didn't happen all at once. It happened in micro steps, small shifts in posture and tone that the cameras caught but the audience didn't fully register until later. Bannister's shoulders, which had been squared and rigid, softened. His eyes, which had been hard with certainty, flickered with something closer to doubt. He looked down at his notes, prepared questions about Frazier, about the trial, about Ali's financial troubles, and then he set them aside. I wrote things about you, he said, and his voice cracked slightly. I wrote that you were a coward, that you didn't deserve to come back. I believed it when I wrote it. Ali waited. Bannister looked up, and his eyes were wet. I don't know if I was wrong, but I don't know if I was right either. And that's hard to sit with. Ali reached across the space between them, the physical gap of 2 feet, the ideological chasm of 3 years, the cultural divide of a country tearing itself apart, and he placed his hand on Bannister's shoulder. The gesture was so unexpected, so devoid of triumph or condescension, that the audience gasped. It's supposed to be hard, Ali said. If it was easy, everybody would do it. But you asked me the question. You listen to the answer. That's more than most people do. Bannister nodded. And the silence that followed wasn't the oppressive silence of confrontation. It was the sacred silence of recognition. Two men who'd spent years on opposite sides of a cultural war, sitting in a television studio, acknowledging that maybe, just maybe, the war itself was the problem. The interview continued for another 10 minutes, but the heat was gone. Hendricks asked about future fights, and Ali answered with his usual flair, the armor sliding back into place. But every few minutes, Bannister would ask a question, and the question would be different, softer, more curious than combative. When the cameras finally stopped rolling, Ali stood, shook Hendricks's hand, and then turned to Bannister. The journalist extended his hand, and Ali took it, pulling him into a brief embrace. The audience, unsure whether to applaud or remain silent, did both, scattered clapping that grew into something fuller, not for a victor, but for the strangeness and beauty of what they'd just witnessed. 30 years later, in 2001, Bannister published a memoir about his career in sports journalism. An entire chapter was devoted to that 1971 interview. He described it as the moment he stopped being a sports writer and started being a human being trying to write about sports. He wrote about how, in the years after, he'd covered Ali's fights differently, not as a fan, but as someone trying to understand the cost of conviction. When Ali's Parkinson's diagnosis was made public in 1984, Bannister was one of the first journalists to visit him, and the two men spent an afternoon in Ali's home in Los Angeles, not talking about boxing, but about faith, family, and what it means to be remembered. Bannister wrote a column that week titled "The Man Who Taught Me to Listen," and it was syndicated in over 200 papers. He retired in 1995, and when he gave his farewell speech at the National Sports Writers Hall of Fame induction, he told the story of that night in 1971, and he ended it with this: I came to break him. He let me, and in breaking, I was put back together differently. Ali never spoke publicly about the interview in detail, but those close to him, his trainer, Angelo Dundee, his wife Lonnie, his biographer, Thomas Hauser, said he considered it one of the most important moments of his life, outside the ring, not because he won, but because he didn't have to. The transformation wasn't Dali's, it was Bannister's. And in witnessing that transformation, everyone in that studio, everyone watching at home, was offered the same choice: to hold on to certainty or to sit with the discomfort of not knowing, to see the person across from you as an enemy or to see them as a human being carrying their own weight. This is what grace looks like. When it's not performed, it's not loud, it's not showy. It's a man sitting in a studio, exhausted from being a symbol, choosing to offer understanding to someone who came to destroy him. It's a journalist realizing that the story he'd been telling about courage was incomplete and having the humility to say so. It's an audience holding its breath, not because of what was said, but because of what was made possible. A moment where the script flipped, where the villain became a student, where the hero chose teaching over triumph. And in that choice, everyone present was reminded that the greatest victories aren't fought in rings or on battlefields. They're fought in the quiet spaces where we decide whether to harden or to open, to attack or to listen, to win or to understand. Ali chose understanding, and 50 years later, we're still learning from it.